Hi, this is Pia Knudsen from UFO Denmark, and on behalf of our group, I'd like to welcome you, Dave. This is Dave Beaty. Am I saying it correct?
Yes, Beaty.
Beatty, okay. And you're famous because you have done this great documentary about the Nimitz encounters, about the UFO incidences on the west coast of the United States in 2004. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you. It's great to be here with the speed of light across the ocean. We're all together in the same room. So,
It's amazing, yeah. But when you're ready, you can just, take us through your slides here, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
okay, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, hopefully some of the listeners have seen the film. Of course, it's been on the internet since November of 2018. I've done a couple versions of it since November. The current version is approximately 25 minutes in length, and it features interviews with some of the witnesses that were on the carrier and the missile cruiser Princeton. So, this whole story for me goes back many years. I was always interested in ufology. I was a field investigator in the 1990s in Florida, and I didn't stick with that for a long time. I was only an investigator for several years with MUFON, and then I sort of got out of the field, and I was pursuing my career in television. I was a journalist for about a decade, both in New York State and then also in Florida, at broadcast television stations and network affiliates. So I wasn't really involved for quite a long time with the UFO field, although I did keep up with it in reading and so on. And back maybe a couple of years ago, I started connecting with some of my friends that were still involved, doing blogs and so on, and they were telling me about some stuff that had come out on the internet, specifically this group that had done a pseudo press conference called To the Stars. And in that press conference, which I believe was in the fall of 2017, they began talking about this incident involving the USS Nimitz and strike fighter squadrons that had encountered unknown objects. And that this group consisted of these very high-level government individuals in the United States. It was just kind of unique because they all were standing behind this rock star named Tom DeLonge, who was famous for his recording career with the group Blink 182. It was a unique sort of thing, and so at that time, we started looking at this case, or going out on the internet basically and trying to scour around. And we began finding some mentions of this 2004 event off the west coast of the United States. There was some mention of it going back to around 2007 on the website Above Top Secret. There were a couple of individuals that were sort of leaking information back then. Not a lot of people knew about it. That this video of the FLIR was actually posted out there back then. It just was not widely known. So probably around December is when all of this kind of broke in the mainstream media, with the New York Times article in December 2017 that basically had a front page article, but then they had a sidebar article about the Nimitz and two pilots that had witnessed these unknown aircraft. So about that time, I started doing some more digging, and I found an article from 2015 in a fighter pilot trade publication called Fighter Sweep. That most of the articles were, pretty straightforward aviation type themes, but there was one written by a gentleman named Paco Cherici, and his article was called There It Was, X-Files Edition. And it goes on to describe in detail this Nimitz 2004 event. And he did a great job in one article of very concisely going through every one of the witnesses that had come forward and in detail describing what they saw from a fighter pilot's perspective, basically talking to other pilots. So he was using terminology that they would, discuss among themselves when it was very technical, but it helped kind of set the scene if you did research and got the background on all of the different types of planes and the, nomenclature that they were using, the acronyms and so on. It painted a very, accurate picture. One thing that I thought was missing was a visual representation of this. You could read about it and in your mind kind of pictured it, but as a filmmaker, I thought, wow, it would be really cool to sort of visualize this. And so that's when I first began thinking about that. Around that time, I had started a Facebook group called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Group. And that name came from the Pentagon program that was revealed in that New York Times article. It was called that. So I started a group on Facebook called that. And we began discussing these cases. And I started posting some 3D animation, 3D stills at first of what I thought that the Tic Tac UFOs looked like that were described. And it got like some pretty good reaction from the people there. They were very encouraging and wanted to see more. And I started, contemplating how a film could be made, even though I didn't have a sponsor at that point. I had no money really to do it. I just had my skill set, my computer systems that I use for work as a videographer. So I began thinking, well, if I put a concerted effort into this, I might be able to use my past experience doing, military documentary films and 3D computer animation to create a movie. The first thing I did is I looked at what the Navy and the United States Department of Defense had as far as footage that I could acquire freely in the public domain. And there's actually quite a wonderful library called the Defense Visual Information System Library. It has still photography and motion picture, high definition, stretches back several decades, all online, all freely available. So there was a lot of good footage there. And, looking at the descriptions from Paco's article and what was, at that point coming out of To the Stars Academy, they had a website that had a pilot's report on it. And, it's very interesting, looking at what Paco was saying, comparing that to what was being said, in To the Stars pilot's report. Later on that summer, in 2018, another report was released by George Knapp of KLAS, and it was called the Executive Summary Report of this incident, basically discussing the Nimitz 2004 event in great detail. It looked at almost every surface vessel that was involved, every radar, every submarine, and it had interviews from all of the people that were involved that they found in this paper. We assume that paper was generated during this ATIP program, perhaps from Bigelow's Bass contract that they were working under ATIP at that time. So when I was looking at all this, I started writing a script and formulating how this could be told in a concise manner from a recreation standpoint. And initially, that's kind of what I did. I just started almost at the point when they had radar targets and moved forward through the intercepts to when they landed back on the ship. It was a very concise, small little recreation. And that was the piece that I kind of finished in November. And then after that, I began getting a lot of contacts from witnesses that were on the internet that saw that recreation. And they began contacting me saying, hey, I was there. I was on Nimitz, or I was on the Princeton, and I have information about this. Kevin Day, for instance, came into my Facebook group, and we had many discussions about it. And I started contemplating how I could bring these gentlemen into my film. I never I never thought that it was a finished film, a finished piece that just was not going to change or evolve. And especially nowadays with the internet, and if I'm not on a conventional movie platform like Netflix or something, I can just come out with a new video every month or something like that. So I had an opportunity in March of this year, actually, to meet up with these guys. We were all together out in Nevada in March, and it was a great opportunity for me to interview them. So that's where I got the interviews that you see now in the film. And if you want, I can sort of take your listeners through the event. I know that everyone probably knows about it, but I can, I'm pretty good at going through and describing it as well. So if you want, I have some slides here.
Very much. Thank you very much. Do that, please.
Yeah. Okay. So the Nimitz encounters is based on an event that happened in November of 2004, about 90 miles southwest of San Diego, California. And at that time, the Nimitz strike group was doing workup training pre-deployment to the Persian Gulf and, that part of the world. As you know, back in 2004, we were involved in some of these conflicts in the Middle East and Afghanistan and so on. And what the Navy would usually do is bring the carrier battle groups that were going to be deployed into their training areas and, just off the coast, in these designated military operations area. And they would do all kinds of training that simulated real world environments. For instance, the firefighters would practice their firefighting skills, and the radar ships and, the missile cruisers would use simulations to simulate aerial attack from enemies, and the fighter squadrons and the radar planes would go up in the air and do simulated dogfighting and bombing runs, and all in this controlled environment. I mean, looking at the logs, I even saw that they would simulate torpedo attacks from enemy subs and battle stations and so on. So it was very realistic training. So in the middle of this, probably around November, I'm going to actually show you where this occurred. So this is a map of where the strike group was around mid-November 2004. You can see that they were off the coast of Baja, Mexico, almost due west of Ensenada, and they were operating in this yellow area here. Let me see if I can pull up a laser here. See if that works. Yeah, so in this area right here is where the Nimitz strike group. We've learned that at that time it was probably just one or two vessels that were out there. The USS Nimitz was the aircraft carrier, and USS Princeton was the guided missile cruiser that was with Nimitz. Some of the other ships hadn't yet arrived at that location. It has been reported that there were other ships there, but based on the ship's logs that we received via FOIA, it indeed appears that they were not there, and then there may have only been two vessels there at that time. So about 10 November, the Princeton is conducting radar sweeps with their Spy 1 Bravo radar system, and Senior Chief Kevin Day was the air intercept controller, sort of a tactical operations specialist in the Combat Information Center on Princeton, which is sort of the nerve center on that ship that can control all of the weapon systems. For instance, the missiles, they have cruise missiles, they have surface air missiles, they have a sonar suite that's there, they have various radars, including the Spy 1. All of this technology is called the Aegis system, and some people say Aegis. It's one of the most sophisticated radar suites that our Navy has. The capabilities of the Spy 1 Bravo radar that were in use in 2004, very sophisticated classified system. The gentlemen that I spoke with that were there that day you know, they can say what's not classified. Basically, they can say that they could see, the radar could see to the horizon, 256 nautical miles from the ship. And, you know, if I said, well, how high up can the radar scan? They just would not say anything. In other words, they couldn't tell me how high up it could scan because that's classified. But if I had to guess, I would say very high. You know, so anyways, they were conducting you know, some training on the 10th, and they knew that that later that week that they were going to be launching aircraft from the Nimitz to do simulated air defense exercises called ADEX. And the way they do this is they'll send up the various squadrons of FA-18 Super Hornets, and one squadron might play the blue force, another squadron would play the red force, then they would pair off against each other doing simulated aerial dogfighting and practicing their skills and so on. So that was slated to take place later on that week. So, you know, on the 10th or around that time, Kevin was a little unsure of exactly the day. They began picking up these strange radar tracks in the CIC on Princeton. And he said that they were strange just because it would appear in groups of 5 to 10 at a time. And they seemed to be going due south at about 100 knots or 120 knots. And they were appearing, you know, to come down sometimes, but on his, you know, watches that he stood, he said that he saw them mostly around 28,000 feet. I know that there's been some conjecture that they came down from a higher altitude, and, you know, that could have been like a ballistic missiles console that there was other people in CIC that were looking at much higher airspaces, but his airspace was more around the jet altitude, which is around 30,000 feet. So he said that these cracks shouldn't have been going that slow because aircraft at that altitude normally would be traveling much faster, you know, 500-600 knots or something like that. So the fact that they were going at 100 knots didn't make any sense. He said that you know, an aircraft might fall out of the sky at that altitude going that slow. It would stall, and, you know, perhaps it wouldn't be able to fly. So it was kind of odd. They took the Spy 1 Bravo radar down and did calibration on that system because they thought that maybe they were getting, you know, some type of, you know, echo, false echo, or other radar clutter that shouldn't actually be showing up as tracks. So they took the system down and brought it back up, rebooted the system basically. And when it came back up, the tracks actually were much better, much clearer. And Kevin indicated that this actually would mean that, you know, these are real objects that the radar's tracking. He's also stated that there were other radars that were picking this stuff up as well. It wasn't just one radar. I know that the Nimitz had a radar system as well. So perhaps that's what he was talking about. You know, at that point, he was kind of concerned because, you know, here's these anomalous objects that are appearing, you know, pretty close to the carrier. He said that they would come onto his scope around San Clemente Island and Catalina Island, which is, you know, 100 and something miles north of their position. And they would come down south. He said that they weren't really a threat to the battle, you know, group there. His concern was that they were more of an air navigation and safety issue, that he was preparing to launch a whole bunch of aircraft that were going to be training in that same piece of sky. So he was a little bit concerned that here's these objects that they don't know what they are. They're like balloons or some kind of, you know, light plane or something that doesn't seem to respond to any radio. It doesn't have transponders. They didn't know what they were. And, you know, at that point, I don't think they were that concerned about a threat. They were just concerned about air safety. And so he talked to the captain, I think on the day, it was November 14th when they were going to launch the planes. And they said, you know, we need to check this out. Can we send one of the flights of FA-18s out there to intercept the one of these objects, to take a look at it and get an ID on it. And the captain agreed. So on the morning of November 14, they decided to send the flight, and it was the Black Aces VFA 41 fighter attack squadron that was launching that morning. And so they picked, one of the first flights that kind of took off that morning, and they wanted to take control of that flight. The E-2 Hawkeye plane. In fact, let me see if I have see what our slides are here, and if I can go to the next one. So this is like the Nimitz aircraft carrier here. This is the Princeton radar ship that had the Spy 1 Bravo radar. It's called a phased array radar. You can see this is the radar cells here. It doesn't rotate around like a conventional radar would kind of spin around. These radars, there's some over here too, have like receipts, they have the receivers built right into these like grid, and it's very sensitive. So that morning, the fighters were taking off, as well as the E-2 Hawkeye radar planes. This is a E-2 Hawkeye from the Wallbangers squadron here. And you can see that they have about a 24-foot radar dish on top of the Hawkeye. They get up high in the air, and because they have that altitude, they can see much farther past the horizon, and they can, these are the guys that direct the fighters to the bad guys. Like when they go up, they can see aircraft that might be in the airspace, hundreds and hundreds of miles away, and so they can vector the fighters to do these intercepts. So really that morning, that was sort of the idea, was to get the Hawkeye to bring one of the fighter jets over to these unidentified objects. So there's two jets in the Black Aces flight in the call sign is Fast Eagle that morning. And in the first jet was Commander Dave Fravor and his backseat weapons system officer, who we don't know, that person hasn't come forward. In the other jet, there was a kind of a new pilot, a woman that also has not come forward. She did do an interview on the To the Stars Academy's Unidentified TV show, I think episode 1, and you can hear her voice if you do look at that History Channel show. But her identity has, been hidden up to this point. Her weapon system officer was Jim Slate, a lieutenant commander at that time, and a very senior, experienced pilot. Many times in the training environments, they would pair a very senior pilot with a newer pilot, just to help them kind of establish the routine of these training evolutions and so on, and give them help to bring them up to speed. So these are the pilots in those two FA-18s. There's a Super Hornet there, and the Super Hornet's unique in that they do have, it's two-seaters. The F version of the FA-18 has 2 seats, and it's quite a bit bigger than the C version, C and D, in the previous versions of the FA-18. So it helps with situational awareness, because the pilots, their workload is a little bit less, because they have a backseater that's dealing with radios, navigation, weapon systems, and much of that extra work that the pilot would have to do in the one-seater version of this aircraft. So the Fast Eagle flight is contacted by the E-2 Hawkeye, and the Princeton contacts the E-2 as well, and is asking if they have any radar contacts. The E-2 responds that they don't have any radio contacts that are unknown at this time. And the Princeton is able to send, it's called a Link 16 data link. So they can send the fighter pilots, and they can send the E-2 pilots and radar operators a target that is linked in from their radar on the surface vessel. So the Spy 1 radar has a target. They can send that target to all the aircraft that are operations. In other words, now everyone knows where this is. It's not like only one radar sees it. It's kind of a shared environment at that point. So Black Aces are controlled now by the Princeton, and the Combat Information Center on Princeton. They also have air intercept controllers on the Princeton as well as the E2. So they kind of take the E2 out of the game at this point. Now they're going to control them directly, and they begin vectoring them into the unknowns, which were, I believe, approximately 60 miles away. And the data that we have is it was almost due south of where the Nimitz was. So if you can think of, off the coast of Baja, and you go due south about 60 miles, that's sort of where these unknowns were. And they begin vectoring these black aces death out to that location. About the same time, one of the fighters from the Marine Corps air wing that was on the Nimitz is hearing some sort of these radio calls, and he was also in the area, and they contacted him. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Kurth, and they brought him over to that same piece of sky to take a look to see if he could see anything. And he arrived first, actually, around that area, and he didn't see anything on his radar. He did see this kind of disturbance in the water. And if you can imagine, if you're at 10 or 20,000 feet above the ocean on a clear day, and if you look down, he said that it was just a clear, calm ocean at that time, and he sees this white disturbance that's several hundred feet or several hundred meters in length. It looks sort of like white water breaking over something. He's described it as kind of roiling or boiling water. And it was very odd. About that time, the radar operators kind of pull him off of the mission. And, the reason was because Fast Eagle flight was coming in. And so they call him off, and so he takes off. The radar officers ask, or the air intercept controllers, the tactical officers on the Princeton ask fighter pilots if they're carrying any ordnance or live weapons on their fighters. This has sort of been something that has been brought up several times as far as, were they asking if they had weapons because they thought they should, because they might be facing some type of threat, or were they saying, do you have weapons? They wanted to make sure they did not have any weapons. And, for the longest time, I was unsure about that because even some of the pilots had said that perhaps they were being sent out to some type of terrorist aircraft that was coming in, threatening the aircraft carrier. This is not that long after 9/11. You have to realize. So, airplane that don't have transponders that are coming, pilots might have thought that there could have been some threat like that at that point. Kevin Day later assured me that it wasn't that they wanted to see if they did have them because there was a threat. He said that they didn't want to send any aircraft out there that had any live ordnance, because it was a training exercise, and they wanted to make sure that no one started accidentally shooting missiles in a training environment. So he kind of cleared that up for me at that point. So the Black Aces, the two jets from the Black Aces, Commander Fravor in the lead, the female in the wingman jet, arrived on that radar point in the sky. They call it the merge plot, and it's radar track that when the fighter pilot's radar track gets to the same point where this unknown track is, they come together and there's a merge plot. At that point, they're about 20,000 feet. They don't have an object on radar. They don't see anything visually at this point. They look down and they see that white water that Lieutenant Colonel Kurth had seen just prior. So they are looking at this thing. Commander Fravor described it as what he thought looked like a 737, 10 feet under the water. And it's concerning because they think that, okay, this intercept has just turned into a search and rescue operation, because whatever this thing was, now it had crashed into the water. Commander Fravor contacts his wingman and says, stay here at this altitude in high cover. I'm going to go down and check out this whitewater disturbance. So he peels off and begins a turning descent towards the whitewater, and he's looking at it coming down, through 10,000 feet and so on. And at about that point, I believe his backseater and him see something at the same time, and they're like, his backseater's like, "Sir, are you looking at what I'm looking at?" And they see this white object here, and this thing is darting around, like he said, like a ping pong ball, like stopping and hovering and darting around this object that's underwater here. Commander Fravor said that it looked like it was by the right forward of the right wing, and then it came up to like where the cockpit might have been, and it was like checking it out. That's what he has stated. And about this time, he's coming around, kind of circling around this. He says that this object almost seemed to notice his presence. And he said it turned towards him, its kind of front end of this thing, and began coming up. So he's coming down, and this object turns towards him and starts coming up. And it begins mirroring his turn rate. So if you can imagine that he might be 2 or 3 miles away from it coming down, this thing starts coming up, and they're doing this like circle in the sky. So they're both mirroring each other like in a big circle. To a fighter pilot, this thing is executing a defensive move, actually. Really, a fighter jet is going to try to get behind an object. That's, in an intercept, they want to come in and get behind the object that they're intercepting. So he's coming around doing this turn. This object is coming up. And so you can imagine the radio calls at this point that he's, sending back to Princeton. I can't even imagine what this would have been like. And the pilot that's up there at 20,000 feet is looking down ringside seat to all this. Can't really imagine what they thought as well. So here's the F-18s and looking down to the disturbance. Here's the object that they said looked like a Tic Tac. And that's kind of entered our lexicon, this aerial flying 47-foot long Tic Tac. Didn't seem to have any kind of wings, no propulsion, no plume that would be evident if it had a jet engine that was belching, hot gases. And it also seemed to be flying in a way that an aircraft couldn't fly unless it was a helicopter, but it didn't really seem to fit any kind of flight profiles that they were aware of. So it's sort of intriguing and a little frightening, I'm sure, to them. So they're coming around in this turning fight. Here's the object. Jim Slate actually, I believe, several of these guys mentioned seeing these protrusions coming out on the bottom of this object. Whether they were curved or came straight down, if they were side by side. I kind of used my best guess because I wasn't able to actually talk to Commander Fravor. I did try, but he didn't respond to me. So I wasn't exactly sure if this is how they look, but this is my interpretation of the protrusions. Commander Slate, I did talk to him in LinkedIn. I did some messaging back and forth with him. He also did an interview with the Scientific Coalition for Ufology's researcher, Robert Powell. And he described this surface of this thing almost being like a mirage, a heat haze type of mirage, like surface, almost like it had like some type of plasma around the outside of it. I showed that a little bit in my film. Here you don't see that in this graphic. There you see that a little bit more here in this type of surface here of distortion. So as Commander Fravor's coming down, he's doing the circle. He says that he comes around maybe a mile apart. This object suddenly turns and begins facing him, and in less than a second, it's like gone. It crosses his nose, and he's gone to the horizon in less than a second. so he says, this thing went hypersonic, and obviously seeing something like that, and there's 4 air crew there, they all saw it, they all witnessed it. The Princeton, the radar operators were tracking this, they were listening to calls, they had this object on their radar screen. I don't know that the E2 Hawkeye, the actual dish, had a radar lock on this small UFO, but they did know about it. So here's the, here, I'm going to go back one sec. I'm just going to mention that the E2 Hawkeye did see this object. One of the crewmen contacted me and said that, while this was going down, one of these objects, whether it was this one or another one, did appear by the Hawkeye. And he says the entire crew from the Hawkeye witnessed this object. He said it formed up on the Hawkeye for a few seconds before taking off. So that's a whole nother story, but it's sort of interesting that there are other witnesses out there. The guy from the Hawkeye doesn't want his name used. He says that he still has a clearance and he doesn't want his name used, but he did confirm the story for me. So, so one of the interesting things that I don't have in this slideshow is that after the object took off to the horizon, the radar operators on the Princeton contacted Commander Fravor and Fast Eagles and said, "Hey, sir, the thing that you were tracking is now at your cap point." The cap point is a tactical coordinate that all the fighter pilots and all the radar controllers know, and it's a rallying point for the airplane. So it's classified, information. Basically, they can move this thing around. This cap point can be anywhere, but it does show up so that the fighter pilots, when they launch, they can go to this rendezvous point to form up with the other planes, get ready to do their missions. And when they're done with their missions, they might go back to the cap point. It could be more than one cap point. Goes back to the beginning of fighter combat, actually, that terminology. But in this case, this object had seemed to know where the cap point was because it flew back to the cap point. And the fighter pilots were kind of concerned about that, because how did this object, first of all, in a few seconds, travel the 60 miles to this cap point, and how did it know where it was? That's something that no one's ever been able to answer. So the pilots from Black Aces, Fast Eagles, they land back on Nimitz after this. They might have continued to do some training, I'm not sure, but they eventually landed. And the next aircraft that takes off loads a Atfleer pod. This is almost like a bomb, like it looks like, but it attaches to the belly, a pylon on the F-18, and they put one of these things on the next airplane that's going to take off. And this is the system that imaged the Tic Tac that we all know from the internet, and it's called FLIR 1. It's like a 1 minute, 14-second little video clip of a fuzzy white object in the center of the screen. And that was imaged by the next flight of jets. Commander Fravor didn't film that, or anyone in his flight, but the next flight did, using this system right here. It can image in infrared and electro-optical TV mode, and it has several zoom, it can zoom in basically on an object using various lenses and so on within the system. It's pretty interesting, high-tech device. And it's also quite interesting that these videos were released, because this is a classified system, and up until that point, no imagery, even just regular kind of gun camera imagery of other things, hasn't really come out because of the nature of the sensitivity of this sensor system, basically. So it's kind of remarkable that not only do we get to see the symbology and so on of this device here, this is the symbology, which over time we've kind of figured out all of this stuff here on the screen. So very, very interesting that this footage was released. Let's see what else we got here. Well, after my film first came out in November, that showed that simulation of what I just described, several other people contacted me. I have Kevin Day that appeared sort of on the scene, I think of May 2018, pretty sure, along with a fire controlman named Gary Voorhees. And later on, after my film came out, Jason Turner and Patrick Hughes contacted me via email. And they have an interesting story as well, because these guys were surface Navy sailors. They weren't in the aircraft. So they had a perspective of this event from another location. All three of them, except for Patrick, were on the Princeton. Patrick was on the Nimitz. Kevin was the senior air intercept controller on Princeton. So he was in charge of all the radar operators that were, doing the intercept, tracking these objects and so on. Gary was a fire control man. He was a technician that basically maintained all these computer systems in the Combat Information Center. So his job was to maintain everything. He could move around in those environments and talk to the different technicians and talk to the radar operators and talk to the sonar men. So he had a very interesting perspective. Jason wasn't involved in the Combat Information Center. He was involved in the ship stores and medical division. But he had a clearance because he had to enter these areas to deliver supplies. Like, he would bring supplies to various individuals. He saw a video in a secure space on the Princeton. It's called the Ship Signal Exploitation Space, and it's sort of an intel space where they're looking at all of the data that's coming in, perhaps from their radars and other displays. So Jason saw a video that he says was approximately 8 to 10 minutes in length, much longer than the 1 minute little clip that we have that's out there now. So he said that he saw an object doing all kinds of maneuvers, right angle turns and so on. And it was very interesting to hear his take on it as well. So Patrick, over on the Nimitz, worked for the Wallbangers E2 squadron. And his buddy was on the E2, the one that saw the Tic Tac. Patrick's job involved retrieving the removable memory cartridges from the E2 when they landed. And these memory cartridges contained all of the sort of radar and sensitive classified data from the flight. It was like a radar flight recorder, basically. It had communications, it had the CEC, it's called. It had a technology called ESM, which is an RF recording counter kind of intel, or actually electronic surveillance system, basically. So he retrieved these data bricks from the Hawkeye that had landed, and they store them in their workspace in these crypto safes for classified information. So they bring them down and put them in the safe after the flight. So he told me that within an hour or so that his commanding officer arrives, knocks on his door, they have to unlock the door. He wants those data bricks from the flight. And Patrick said this was highly unusual, that his CO had actually never even come down to his part of the ship because it was hard to get to. Usually it would have been like somebody like just in lower rank if somebody needed something. But he said that his CO was there, and he had in tow what he describes as 2 U.S. Air Force officers that were there for these data bricks as well. So he hands over the data bricks, and these guys leave. He just said that it was highly unusual. And he said that when his friend landed, that his friend was asked not to talk about this. They had to sign some, non-disclosure agreements, and they were told not to talk about anything that they had, encountered. At least I'm not exactly sure of that. His friend confirmed it for me that this happened, but he wouldn't really discuss it. So I'm not exactly sure what they were told not to talk about. He did confirm that it happened, and Patrick, also as well, said that they were told, once his friend came back and started to say anything, they were told to shut up and not discuss it anymore. Shortly thereafter, people also arrived on USS Princeton. Remember that, Patrick was on Nimitz. So somebody arrives on Princeton via a helicopter, and Gary witnessed this. Gary had chain of command for his recordings, and these people came aboard, and his commanding officer signed out or retrieved the tapes from the CEC that he had been recording, and the Spy One, the Aegis stuff that Gary was in charge of recording. So they took all of that. They also told him, we're going to wipe out your system, basically reboot the system to start over, and I want you to also erase even the blank tapes that you have. Kevin Day later mentioned that he went back to review some of the communications between the pilots that had been recorded in the air intercept controllers, and he couldn't understand why the timestamps for the transmissions were there, but the actual communications were erased. And Gary said that that's exactly why, because he was asked to erase this stuff. They did take it. These officials took this information, but what was left on the Princeton was erased, and that's why that was no longer there for Kevin to even see it. Let's see what else I have here. So there's Jason in his ship stores job. He actually was in submarines before he came aboard the USS Princeton. So he served some time on the submarines. Here's Kevin Day with another sailor. Kevin Day was, his rank was very high for an enlisted sailor. This is Kevin at Fallon, Nevada, at the Top Gun School. Actually pretty famous Navy Top Gun fighter school. And here's Kevin, and the air intercept controllers would go to Fallon with the fighter pilots and train with them, because obviously they wanted these guys fighting as one unit, and the air intercept controllers are just as important, really a key part. I believe this is Commander Fravor over here. I think that's him, a younger Commander Fravor. So here's Patrick Hughes standing in front of Banger, and I think that's even the same number I have on my animation, the 601 there. E2 Wallbanger Squadron on USS Nimitz. Here's that's Patrick's DD-214 from his separation from the Navy. Gary Voorhees, and then this is in March when we were out in Nevada together, filming some interviews for the documentary. And there's Jason and Gary, I think, and out in the desert. And we did a panel group at this presentation with Robert Kiviat as the moderator, basically discussing, the perspective from these other gentlemen. I mean, we've heard a lot from the fighter pilots. Obviously, their trained observers and their descriptions and opinions are, top notch. Obviously, they're probably the key element in all of this, especially for their visual observations. And some of these other gentlemen, when you put all of this together, it forms a very, very interesting radar visual FLIR case. There's so many moving parts to the case. It's extremely interesting. So there's 601. Interestingly enough, I'll just give you a little Easter egg here. There's several Easter eggs in my film. One being that the guy that was the radar guy on the Hawkeye that doesn't want to come forward, one of his other careers is 3D graphics and modeling, and he actually did this model. So this is his Hawkeye model, and I had to pay him a little. He didn't give it to me for free. I had to pay him a little for it, but I did send him a poster. But this is his 3D model that he gave me in Cinema 4D, his textures as well. So that's kind of a little Easter egg. One of the other people that you may have heard of. Sean Cahill was on Unidentified, in the History Channel show. He was a Princeton sailor. He did a little music for me in the film, so there's some music in there that one of the Princeton witnesses did. There is our anonymous witness on the Hawkeye that's also a 3D modeler. We call him Roger. So there's a U.S. government non-disclosure agreement. And some of the green shirts from the wall bangers working on a Hawkeye. So I hope you guys enjoyed my little show and tell here. It's quite interesting. I always enjoy telling the story. So
Thank you very much. We did. It's a lot of information. And we're going to have some questions in a moment. First of all, I will just ask one from Grant Cameron, who couldn't join us because he couldn't log in. So his question is, this was happening in international waters, was it not?
Yeah, I mean, I believe, right? Once you leave 10 to 12 miles off the coast, you're in international waters. That's my understanding.
Yeah. Doesn't that influence anything that it wasn't American waters or territory?
Not sure. I mean, people have speculated about what these objects were, if it was some type of special access project, black aircraft that actually was being tested out there. I'm not sure how it being in international waters. Obviously it could have been Russian or Chinese technology that was being tested. The problem with the theories about that it could have been like our adversaries military is that the performance and envelopes that were described of these objects defy any conventional aircraft that we have. And it even begs the question, why are we developing the F-35s, for instance, these ultra modern aerial platforms that cost the American taxpayers, for instance, billions of dollars to develop, and each one of them is millions and millions of dollars that are based on conventional jet engines and so on, if indeed we'd have some type of hypersonic performing anti-gravitic craft, or our adversaries.
Okay. I have a question from Steve who says, do you believe this is a terrestrial? You don't really, you haven't been out saying that you believe it's something perhaps extraterrestrial. Could you tell us your opinion on what you believe? Or
Yeah, I mean, I sort of am on the fence, as many other people are, and I think that it depends on the day. To be honest with you, I mean, one day I might think that, what if this is some type of a technology that's based on a holographic projection, either from satellites or submarines or something, and they figured out a way to project, a la Star Wars, Princess Leia, like a three-dimensional object in space that's actually not physical, and it's a decoy system that they can use to fool an enemy, aircraft or something like that. It's kind of an interesting theory, and I'm like, okay. And I talked to the military veterans as well, and they've come up with other, similar types of things. And I think that in some ways they say, oh, yeah, it's definitely ours. It's got to be. But then on other days, I start thinking, people have talked to me about these Channel Islands and this area of the world by San Clemente and Santa Catalina Island. So they say that this stuff has been going on there for decades, going way back, to the 1950s and so on, that there's been reports of both above water objects and below water objects in that. And people have said to me, I've gotten actually, lots of emails from people saying, hey, there's an underwater base near these islands. I'm not sure who runs the base, but they claim that there's this underwater base there. So, there's other days where I'm like, could it be some type of other non-terrestrial, like, or alien? I don't know. I don't know if I'm there yet with the alien thing with this, but
No,
yeah.
that's fine. That's fine. I was also supposed to ask you if you've seen the documents that's come out recently. It's all over the place. These 3 documents that's come out. Um, People believe it's the former Edgar Mitchell, the astronauts' archive or documents that are being leaked. Have you heard about this? Followed this at all?
Yeah, I've kind of tried to stay up with it. Obviously, it's a breaking story in ufology, that these documents were released, and I know that several Grant Cameron and several Danny Silva and several other researchers had these, and they were sort of waiting. They said that they were out there. They were published, but they didn't reveal them until several weeks ago, and that the first one that was revealed was this Kit Green, Eric Davis document that talks about the alien autopsy video. And the new thing that was talked about was an autopsy report that supposedly Kit Green had read, this report that goes along with this. And he was sort of convinced at that time that it was real, that he had been giving a briefing that this alien autopsy stuff was real. It left me thinking about the whole Ray Santilli thing. One of the people that I talk to regularly is Robert Kiviat, who is a producer that did the Fox television special on the alien autopsy. So I still want to talk to him to sort of get his take on it, because he was involved in that whole thing, believe me, when that film came out. There's also a really good, I believe it's on Netflix. It's a documentary called something like The Best Hoaxes Ever, or the top, and one of the episodes is on the film, and it basically interviews all of the special effects guys in UK, the people that were involved in filming it. One of the stories I believe that Ray Santilli has said is that the recreations were based on the real film. And I forget the reason why, he said that he couldn't actually use the real film in his film, and that instead they had to recreate the film so that it sort of confuses everybody. I don't know. I mean, really, if you have the film, why couldn't you use it? But I don't know that whole story. Now, the Wilson letter is very interesting, because that sort of, is presenting the idea that there is sort of defense contractors that are in charge of these programs, that it's so secret that even the top level joint chiefs of staff can't access this information. And that would probably even mean the president and our Congress and all of the branches of our government. Only certain people have access to this information. Now, it's my understanding that at the same time, after these letters are coming out, we have Chris Mellon from To the Stars saying that there's actually 8 members of Congress that can access this stuff if they ask for it. So maybe, even though Admiral Wilson, I think that's right, it was his rank at that time, couldn't get past this wall of secrecy from the aerospace companies, and was told to stand down or you're going to lose some of your stars, strip them off, that Chris Mellon says there are some people in Congress that can get access to this information. So,
Okay, yeah, it's going to be interesting to follow this story. But that was Grant Cameron's questions to you. Steve, also a member here who's on here today. I'm just going to read a question he has. He says that he says here, one moment. The final theory was the first person who leaked this gun camera footage in 2007, and he did it on the site above Top Secret. Now this person again has reappeared, and are you in communication with him at the moment? And do you know the status of his intentions?
Well, you know, I did post on Above Top Secret. I had to figure out how to log into there again because it's been so long. But yeah, you know, Isaac Coy, the researcher that I believe was involved with that discussion back in 2007, sort of came back and said, "Oh, the final theory has reemerged, and I'm pretty sure that it's the same person." So people were asking him questions, and he was sort of receptive. Now, the first thing that I thought was, if this person had access to these recordings, was there indeed a longer version of the FLIR film? Because Jason Turner in my film says that yes, there was. So I was interested, and I did post that question. Isaac got back to me and said that the Final Theory Returns didn't keep any of the documents that he had from back then. So whether that's true or not, I'm not sure, but I've been trying to figure out if there's anything new or if he's just there to answer questions from 2007. I'm not sure.
Okay. I'm just going to get to Steve's last question I'm going to ask here. And this is, of course, you can answer as you like, but David Fravor was at a conference and had spoken a bit about your documentary and the witnesses in this documentary. How's your take on all of this? He was kind of criticizing some of it and didn't want to be a part of it, I believe, yes?
Yeah, that's correct. Again, you know, in the very beginning, I tried to reach out to all of the people that had come forward, you know, basically leaving them messages or sending them email and so on, explaining what I was doing, who I was, what I was doing, what my intentions were. I never really did receive any response from Commander Fravor. Back then, I was like, how can I do a film if I don't have any interviews? At that point, I didn't know anybody, and I was trying to contact people. I reached out to the Stars Academy. I asked them if I could use an excerpt from their interview, which they had posted on their website. I think it's like a 6-minute video with Commander Fravor, and I did receive a response back, and they said that, you know, I could use it as long as I didn't just copy the whole thing. You know, that I just used a small portion of it, that they didn't see too much of a problem with that. So at that point, I felt it was okay. After I posted the film, and I think just because it became so popular, the first version, you know, hit like 1.5 million views in several months. I received an email from To the Stars saying that Commander Fravor contacted them and that he wanted me to take his interview out of my documentary because his intention was only to have it be for To the Stars. Now, I was disappointed to hear that, but, you know, I also respect people's opinions. Again, I wasn't able to get permission directly from him at that time. And as a producer, a lot of times we work with other production companies, and we don't, you know, if I was trying to source some material from somebody, I might go to the production company to get permission. That's how it's usually done. So I assumed that was okay, but apparently he didn't like it or something.
It's very brave of all of these witnesses to step forward.
And let me add something too, because you know, it's easy to criticize people, but where's the debate? All of the guys in my film, you can go to my website. I've linked their social media accounts right there, and even though they do lose some of their privacy, as I said, they're willing to answer anyone's questions. They're reachable. They're on, you know, Twitter and Facebook and so on. You can go and friend request them, and hey, if you have a good intention, they may add you as their friend and you can have a conversation with them. So as far as I'm concerned, they have nothing to hide and they're willing to answer anyone's questions.
Great. Thank you for answering that. Move on to a question. Carsten has a question. He'll be coming on in a moment. Carsten?
Yeah, hi. My question is that during this, when you was making this movie, right? Have you ever been, during that process, been contacted by the intelligence companies?
Not well, not that I know of. I mean, obviously you read about stuff that there's people that, portray different roles that are actually involved in the intelligence field. I mean, I was just doing a movie that was a recreation of of pretty much material that has already been out there. I mean, the only stuff that I came out with that was new was the specific stuff with taking records. I don't think that anyone else had ever mentioned that people were told not to talk. People were told to sign non-disclosure agreements. People worked there had hard drives and tapes taken. That was all kind of new, and I didn't even expect it actually. So there's that, but no one's ever like contacted me, seeking kind of strange information of why I was doing it, or that led me to believe that they were part of the intelligence establishment.
Okay, I have another question. While you were making this movie again, did you have access to the USS Nimitz or Princeton to do some filming on it?
No, unfortunately, I did not. I didn't ever really seek that, because I didn't have any budget to do the film. I never was pursuing setting stuff like that. I mean, obviously, I would have loved to have gone down that road where I could have gone and filmed on an actual vessel like that. And in some cases, you can. It just depends. In this case, because of the financial restraints that I have, I never pursued that. And I was able to find some very, very good footage of the Nimitz in the Princeton from the Defense Visual Information Library. And so maybe in a future version, we can have actual recreations on the vessels themselves. That would be very interesting.
That would, for sure. I have a question. I'm just gonna, the gimbal case went on for 2 years. Some were saying 270 days, but I've heard up to 2 years they were having experiences. And when they went out to the Middle East, the phenomenon, no, I can't say, the UFOs kind of continued showing up out in the Middle East when they were deployed there. Have you heard of anything similar on the Nimitz case when they've moved on to whatever they're going to be doing, that they again have experienced something?
Yeah, I mean, I did ask each one of the guys if they had ever had experiences like this in any other parts of their career. As you remember, I mean, Kevin had, I think, 17 years in Aegis cruisers, and every one of them said, no, I had never seen a UFO. I had never seen a USO underwater. I have never seen anything like this until that week in November. So I've had lots of other witnesses come forward via email and contact me that have indicated that they indeed have seen UFOs from military ships, Navy ships, and so on. I have lots and lots. I have, I think, over 500 now emails from witnesses, not all military, but quite a few military service members that stretch back decades to, Vietnam and even before that, that were relating to me experiences they had all over the world. But as far as the Nimitz guys that I'm in contact with, none of them have ever seen anything else during their Navy service.
Okay, thank you. Christian, who has a question. Christian will be coming on now.
Yeah, I got a question. In this series, Unidentified, there was a pilot talking about the encounters on the East Coast, and he was asked if he had ever seen anything like this object before, and he didn't want to go down that path, as he says. And I just wondered what did you think he meant by that? And have any of the pilots you have talked to have any experience with so-called UFOs in their private lives? Thank you.
Yeah, so you know, the pilots that have come forward from the USS Roosevelt, it was sort of interesting for several of the researchers that I've been working with to see this happen on the History Channel, namely because we had sort of identified the pilots that were most likely involved. A researcher by the name of Keith Basterfield out of the UK or out of Australia, and a researcher named Christophe Spitzer out of France had begun developing a document, and they were doing research that was looking at all the possible aircraft carriers and squadrons off the East Coast of the United States in 2015. And you know, I was assisting them as well, and we sort of had developed narrowed down to the fighter squadrons that were off the coast of Florida, specifically in January of 2015, and using flight tracks of commercial aircraft that were being diverted away from the areas, the weather patterns, the pilots had mentioned what we actually figured out. I think that we're pretty accurate in saying that it was January 26, 2015, when the gimbal footage was filmed. So when you listen to Graves and Aucoin's comments about this going on for even before that, I think that they said that it started around 2014. One of the interesting things that they said was that they first started noticing this stuff because they had an upgrade to their systems on their FA-18s. And as soon as they got this upgrade to the system, all of a sudden they started picking up these objects. And in the beginning, he said that they would get a track on something with this new system. And I'm pretty sure that the new system, as far as my research, is called the IRST, Infrared Search and Track. I think that is the terminology. And I believe that it was deployed on these fighter jets around that time. The radar itself, the APG-79 ASA radar, it's my understanding that that technology had been installed way before that, like, you know, 2005 is when that radar first began showing up. So maybe I'm wrong about that, but what they said is that they began seeing these objects, and when they would go out to do an intercept on these, you know, tracks, they'd get within a mile or so and they couldn't see it with their eyes. They could pick it up with the infrared. In other words, even their heat seeker training missiles, they could get a lock on an object and it would lock onto this thing. But when they would look out the cockpit, there would be nothing there. And he said that only, I think, in the next year is when these objects became visible and they would start showing up where they would see a spinning top. I think that's what the gimbal, they describe it looking like a spinning top, and you see it rotating and so on. So in some ways, it was technology that allowed them to see it. And you know, that comment kind of went by and people contemplated. I started thinking about objects that are there, but we can't see them. It's sort of a little disconcerting to the idea that you could walk outside and look up in the sky and there could be objects that are there that you can't see visually, but if you had some technology like some type of infrared, you could see an object. In fact, one gentleman that's in my group, Dave Falk, his job is to look at infrared systems. He works on infrared FLIR systems for his job. He first came into this ufology because he had witnessed a case where he recorded an object that showed up on FLIR, but when he turned it to the television visual mode, it disappeared. Couldn't be seen with our eyes or with a TV camera, but it showed up there on the FLIR system. So, you know, obviously technology is moving ahead. If it is related to seeing them with technology, then I think maybe it's going to become more and more and more prevalent that our fighter pilots and military service personnel that are using this technology are going to start encountering this stuff if it really is all over. So,
okay. How do you feel about that? All of a sudden, these senators are getting briefed now. Do you think that this is starting to move forward, that there's going to come more support to get some more money or yeah, some more openness around this topic, since these U.S. senators are going in and getting briefed about it?
I hope so. I mean, on the one hand, you have an argument that can be made that these represent a threat in some ways. They represent a threat to our carrier strike groups or our military installations, that we need to worry about unidentified aircraft that are operating with impunity around military installations or aircraft carriers, for instance, Navy ships. And, you know, I think that argument can be made, and that's kind of probably what we're seeing with some of the groups that had done military-related, classified-related research and study. They want funding to continue that work. And I agree that there is a need to maintain security in those instances. I've always been a proponent of academic research in this phenomenon and the academic study of this. You know, the best and brightest minds in our universities have never really had access to research grants, open discussion of this topic. There's a career-ruining stigma attached to it in many cases. So if you're a physicist or, you know, a biologist or whatever, you know, academic specialty that you have, it would be very difficult to openly study this. I mean, we've seen that, you know, with, like, obviously John Mack and so on. His experience at the academic level was very negative when he began taking it seriously. So I'd like to see more academic grants. And if this, you know, congressional Senate subcommittees and so on results in that, then I'm very supportive of it. I think if it goes to the military study, the public is not going to be privy to that. So,
okay, there are some scientists, part of the To the Stars Academy. They all have scientific backgrounds, like Hal Puthoff, and also in the documents it's just come out with Eric Davis is also a scientist of some sort, and so there have been people working, but it's all kind of really not available for the public, or at least. Yeah,
right. Like Bigelow Aerospace Systems. You know, I think that there was funding that was created during the $22 million ATIP and OSAP program that was, you know, contracted to Bigelow, and they did actually study this stuff with, you know, for several years, but zero of that information has ever come out. Everyone signed non-disclosures agreements. One interesting thing, if you were here from the beginning, you remember me mentioning Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Kurth. After he left the Marine Air, you know, he was like a senior guy there. He went to work for Bigelow Aerospace during that contract. So we haven't ever really figured out how that happened, but it's my feeling that perhaps he was brought on board because he knew all the people, he knew all the other fighter pilots, and so during that research stage, they did actually study all of this. Be interesting if any of that ever becomes public. I'd like to know, you know, what they found out.
We all would, for sure. Okay, Sim is going to come on this time and ask you a question.
Hello? Can you hear me? Yeah. Hi, Dave. Thank you for your presentation.
Welcome.
Well, I have a sort of general question in terms of mindset in the United States. Thinking that here in Europe, there's not much attention to all of this, what is happening in the United States with Nimitz case and all that To the Stars Academy and so on and so on. Do you see you as a media man, do you see any mindset change among ordinary people after all this came out?
Well, you know, I'm a little biased because I've been involved with it for, you know, a year and a half. So in my immediate sphere of people that I deal with, there, you know, there's a little bit of a change because some people might know that I'm interested in this topic that have themselves no interest in it. They may reach out to me and say, hey, did you see that this was on CNN or Fox? I mean, we here in the States, you know, everyone is sort of plugged into CNN and Fox News, and then the major media, ABC, NBC, and CBS broadcasters, and then of course the other web spaces as well. But people would, you know, write me and say, did you notice that this was on CNN? I just wanted to show it to you. It's like they're talking about the UFOs, and they're talking about the briefing of senators. Thought you might want to look at that. So I think that in some ways it's taking in the last year, it's been taken a little bit more seriously. Before that, before 2017, it was very difficult for news organizations to do legitimate stories on the topic in the United States because most newsrooms weren't interested in this subject matter. And if you even tried to do a story that was reasonably serious, you would always get the rolling eyes and the jokes about the little green man, the theme from, you know, the X-Files. Yeah. It was a cliche. So every story that ever came out about, say, somebody that was honestly trying to present it was sort of mocked, and the stigma prevailed. So in the last year or so, it's changed a little bit that now you'll see a story they're not doing those jokes anymore. So, I mean, I'm not sure if that mindset has changed at all, or if you know, in Europe and so on, they look at the United States as, yeah, they believe stuff too easily over there, and they're a little more skeptical. I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you. I have a last question. It's it's both from me and Grant Cameron, because he asked it and I had it on mine also. Grant Cameron has a group of experiencers who's had some kind of extraordinary experiences after seeing a UFO, experiencing lights in the sky or whatever. And have you heard of any of these witnesses having these kind of paranormal or contact alien kind of experiences in the group of witnesses you've spoken with?
Yeah, actually, indeed, I have. You know, Kevin, you know, in the very beginning, he described his experience on the Princeton, but then he went on to describe his experience in his life after it. You know, to average people, when you listen to what he says, you know, you might say, well, you know, well, Kevin must have PTSD or something, or he has some other, because his claims seem outrageous, like that he's attributing all of this stuff in his life to seeing a UFO through binoculars in 2004. I've received lots of emails from individuals that want to tell me about that specific topic. And a lot of them are military service members that say that, you know, one individual in particular told me that it's not the sighting of an object that's the important thing here. He was saying that it's actually you know, what happens to these individuals afterwards. And he told me that it was sort of like an evolutionary change in himself. And he thought that, like, you know, civilization in some ways is going through this evolutionary change. There's quite a few people like that have contacted me that have profound experiences after, you know, UFO encounters. And so, and I'm very open-minded. I mean, I have not put blinders on, or I don't act like I know the answer, because I don't. But if someone honestly wants to present information to me, I'm going to inquisitively ask questions and try to understand, is this related? And when you start getting, 3 to 4 to 5 people that are reporting the same sort of experiences that were happening after the events, it's very interesting. And I think that more research and studies should be done looking at this. I know that Professor Gary Nolan, who was part of the TTSA at one point, has conducted research in brain physiology that looks at possible changes that have occurred in people that have close encounter experiences. So I think that this is like a really good subject area to study experiencers and what the stories that they're telling, how they could help us understand better what this means.
They've also been studying the DNA of people who have had experiences and have been finding some really odd results. But if you don't have time, or you could pass them on to these people, maybe to Grant Cameron. He's studying this a lot, and he could put people in contact where they could get some help or some, talk it through with him, perhaps. I know he's very interested in these cases. I personally don't have any more questions, and it doesn't seem like the group does. Do you have something you would like to add here at the end of this?
No, I mean, to your last point, I think it's important that, I asked people to come forward in my film, and, I was overwhelmed actually with the response that I got, and honest people that are coming forward that want to express, they want to tell their story. I've been contemplating ways to help network them. I mean, one idea that I have is to form a group of military police and pilots, a networking group, so to speak, so that step one would be just to bring them together for mutual support. And then, part of that is definitely looking at ways that others that have had these experiences can help them as well, to help, ease their mind or answer questions and so on. I think it's a very important thing for people that obviously are saying that they've been troubled by this in some way.
Definitely. People should not be alone about this. That's why support groups are very good. They can really help each other with the commonalities of their experiences. It's been very, very interesting, and thank you so much for doing this. It's really, as your documentary also has done, it's made it very, very visual for everyone to see what happened, and then you've done an amazing job. You really have. Thank you for doing this.
Welcome. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. So looking forward to, we hope you're going to move on to perhaps the gimbal case or something else that might come out, and keep producing these good documentaries for us.
Absolutely.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you for all you do.
You're welcome. Appreciate asking me to come and talk today.
You're welcome. Take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.